Welcome to our continuing series, Questions and Answers, from the works of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. Part 22, Will and Willing, Part 1. From the Mother. A question has been put to me on what I told you recently, when we made a distinction between will and willings. I told you that willings, what Sri Aurobindo calls willings, are movements that derive not from a higher consciousness coming down into the being and expressing themselves in acts, but impulses and influences from outside. We kept the word will to indicate that which is, in the individual consciousness, the expression of an order or of an impulse coming from the truth of the being, from the truth of the individual, from the real being, his true self. And we said that impulses, actions, movements that occur in the being and are not that are willings. In fact, I explained to you that without knowing it, or at times even knowing it, you are moved by influences coming from outside, which enter without even your perceiving it, and which raise up in you what you call the will that such a thing should be or such other should not be. So I am asked, what is the nature of these influences, and to give an explanation of their working. These influences are of diverse nature. You may study them from the psychological point of view, or you may study them from a purely mechanical standpoint, the latter generally translating the former. That is to say, the mechanical phenomenon is a kind of consequence of the psychological phenomenon. There are very few people in whom the will of the being expresses the deeper, inner, higher truth. And even in the very best, very few are the moments when it is so. The consciousness of the individual overflows considerably his body. Even we saw that the subtle physical, which is still material in relation to the vital being, and, under certain conditions, is almost visible, overflows at times considerably the visible limit of the physical body. And this subtle physical consists of vibrations, which are active, and which come in contact or mix with the vibrations of the subtle physical of others. And this mutual contact brings about the influences. They are very powerful vibrations and naturally overcome the others. For example, as I have already told you several times, if you have a thought, this thought clothes itself with subtle vibrations and becomes an entity which moves about and wanders in the earth atmosphere, seeking to realize itself as best it can. But your thought is one among millions. There is a multiple and tangled interaction to such an extent that things do not happen as simply and schematically as one would believe. What you call yourself, the individual being, shut up within the limits of your present consciousness, is constantly invaded by vibrations of this kind, which come from outside and appear most often under the form of suggestions. These suggestions, apart from a few exceptions, occur at first in the mental domain. Then they become vital, then physical. To be precise, I do not speak here of the pure mind, but the physical mind. Indeed, the physical consciousness itself has a mental activity, a vital activity, and a purely material activity. And everything that happens in your physical consciousness, in your bodily consciousness, and in your bodily activity enters into you first of all under the form of vibrations of the mental order, and therefore under the form of suggestions. Most of the time, these suggestions enter into you without your being in the least conscious of them. They enter, they awaken in you some response, and then rise up in your consciousness as if it were your own thought, your own will, your own impulse, because you are unconscious of the process of infiltration. These suggestions are innumerable, various, and of very different natures, but they can be classified into three principal orders. First of all, and these are hardly perceptible to an ordinary consciousness, they become perceptible to those only who have already reflected much, observed much, studied much their own being. They are what we may call collective suggestions. When a being takes birth upon earth, he necessarily takes birth in a given country and a given environment. By the very fact of his physical parents, he is born in the midst of a national, social, cultural, and at times religious group. A group of habits of thinking, understanding, feeling, conceiving, all kinds of constructions which are at first mental, then become vital habits, and finally modes of material being. To say more clearly, you are born in a certain society, a certain religion, a certain country. This society has a collective conception of its own. This nation has a collective construction of its own, and which is generally quite fixed. You are born within that. Naturally, while you are young, you are absolutely unconscious of it, but it acts upon your formation. This slow formation, in which hours are added to hours, days to days, and experiences to experiences, which little by little build up a consciousness. You are there, put as if under a bell glass. It is a kind of construction that covers you, and which in a certain way protects you, but in another limits you considerably. All that you absorb without even noticing it, and that makes the subconscious basis of your personal construction. This subconscious base will act on your whole life, and you do not care to free yourself from it. To free yourself from it, first of all, you must be conscious of it, and this first step is the most difficult, because the formation has been very subtle. It was done at a time when you were not a conscious being yet, when you just dropped down stunned from another world into this. Everything is done without your taking part in the least. Consequently, it does not occur to your mind at all that there could be in it something to know, still less something that should be got rid of. But when you become, for some reason, conscious of the sway of these collective suggestions, you perceive at once that a very assiduous, a very prolonged labor is needed to get rid of them. And the problem does not stop there.